Hello everyone, my name is Calla Edwards and we are going to talk about vermicomposting. Now what is vermicomposting? Well, it's a fancy name for composting with worms. Now, normal composting processes are outdoors and you use heat to help kill the bacteria, kill the weed seeds, and to break down the products, whatever your food products, your leaf clippings, your trimmings from plants, your leaves in the fall. Those processes break down by heat. But in the wintertime, we don't have a ton of organic material that needs to be composted. But it'd still be nice to be able to take some of those indoor food wastes that we normally might throw away and turn them into something good. That is where worm composting comes in. Now, worm composting can be done year-round in bins. Now, bins can be made of a variety of materials. They can be made out of plastic, such as what I'm going to use. Some people make them out of wood. Still other people recommend using an old dresser drawer that's long and shallow, and that works really well. You just make a cover for that on top. For tonight, I am going to show you how to make a worm composting bin using two 12-gallon totes. Now our totes don't need to be very deep. Our worms are surface feeders, so we really only want our bins to be about 8 to 12 inches deep total. If you get something that's too big, the worms aren't going to hang around at the bottom. Moisture could build up and it could cause some other problems. So this 12 to 18 gallon size tote works really well. They do need to be opaque in color because worms are very sensitive to light. So clear containers aren't going to work unless you're willing to spray paint them or cover them with some type of material to hide the sun from them. Now you need at least 2 containers. One container is going to serve as the bin where the worm bedding, the worms, and the composting actually happens. Now during that process, worms will create a liquid called compost tea, which is really high in nutrients. It's great for house plants, your outside plants, to make a fertilizer with them. So the top bin is going to be where the worm poop and the composting actually happens. And I'm going to drill holes in the top to let air in, but I'm also going to drill holes in the bottom about every 2 inches to let the extra moisture from the worm tea drip out. And that's where the second bin comes in. This bottom bin is going to be where the worm tea collects, so it doesn't drown the worms or cause the bedding to be too damp. Now, to keep these two from sticking together and to allow for my air holes to be above this bin, I'm going to use 4-inch plastic pots to set in the bottom. That's going to keep them separated, and it's also going to give an extra space in the bottom for the worm tea to collect. Now, every couple weeks, I'll check and dump the worm tea out, use it to fertilize plants, indoors or outdoors, depending on the year. So I won't ever have a ton of it collecting and spend at one time. But you can see when I stack these two or nest these two together, I've got this space across the top. Now, ultimately, after about 4 to 6 months, when the worms have kind of worked through the bedding, they've worked through the compost material that I've put in here, I'm ultimately going to make a second one of these, and I'm going to stack it on top of this one inside of it. The worms are then going to migrate from this bin up to the top one, and I'll be able to pull the compost and things out of this bin and use it. But first things first, let's get my first set of bins made. So I am going to drill holes. Again, my holes should be about 2 inches apart on both here and on the bottom. And I'm going to use a 3/8 inch drill bit. You can use 1/4 to 3/8. It all depends on what you have and what size of worm you are using. Now, before I do that, I do want to say, you cannot use earthworms that you find out in your garden or in your yard for worm composting. They tend to be deeper feeders than the red wigglers, the European superworms that are recommended. And so they're not going to do very well. They're not going to compost the food like we need them to. Red wigglers and the European superworms can compost a pound of food a week per pound of worms. So that is, a general rule of thumb, a rough idea of how much you can expect these worms to go through. So I'm going to drill and we'll be right back. Now that I have my holes all drilled, we are going to stick this bin inside of each other. They are now ready to fill with the worm bedding. Now, worm bedding can be a variety of things. You can use commercial worm bedding. That's actually what I'm using just because it's easy to get a hold of right now. So you can purchase commercial worm bedding. This is made of shredded paper. If you work in an office, you can use shredded office paper as well. The best thing is actually shredded corrugated cardboard, but that can be kind of hard to find. So I have taken my commercial worm bedding. I have been soaking it in water this afternoon. Non-chlorinated water is best, but if you can't get that, they recommend letting your water sit out for about 24 hours for the chlorine to come out. So I'm going to take my bedding, and you want it to feel like a wrung out dish rag. So I'm going to have to take some of the extra water, and I'm going to crumble this up and get this filled into my worm container. And once I get this done, my worms go in. I have my bedding all put into the container. It's ready to go. It's time to add my worms. So I'm going to make a small shallow depression in the worm bedding. And then I'm going to take my worms and dump them into their new home. Now these guys are going to be a little dehydrated. They've been shipped in peat moss to help keep them from freezing this winter, because we did ship them in the winter time. This also apparently helps keep them from getting overheated in the summer. So these guys are going to be very dehydrated. They've lost about 70% of their body weight of water during this trip. So they're definitely a little dehydrated, but they're moving and they appear to be pretty darn healthy. So these guys they look a lot like our traditional earthworm, but these are the European superworms. Most people use red wigglers for their worm composting. However, we like to fish, and I want my worms to kind of be dual purpose. So I purchased the European red wigglers because they're bigger, so we'll be able to use these guys for fishing along with composting. Now, you can purchase worms. There's several reputable dealers online, some good websites. If you contact your local extension office, they would be happy to help you find a good dealer. So I'm going to take some damp newspaper. I'm going to put it over the top of these guys and put the lid on, and I'm going to let them sit, checking to make sure that everything is staying damp. The bedding does need to stay damp at all times because worms are 70% moisture or more. So we do need to check the bedding, make sure it's staying damp, and make sure that our worms are getting rehydrated and healthy. So now that I have my worms in their new home, we've got the cover on, I'm going to put this in the basement. The worms can't freeze. They need to stay relatively warm, similar to house temperatures, in order for them to be the most productive. and especially while they're acclimating. So this winter, I'm going to keep my worm farm in the basement, and in the summertime, I will place it in my garage where it's protected from the elements and the temperature stays fairly consistent, so they don't get too hot and they don't get too cold. About once a week or so, I will feed my worms with vegetable scraps. I hope you learned something about vermicomposting. If you would like some more information, there is some wonderful resources and a more in-depth video into the process on the K-State Garden Hour website. Or you can contact our office and they would be happy to give you some more information. But I hope everyone is having a wonderful day and happy growing.